Welcome to the Kickoff webinar for the Bicycle and Pedestrian Count Technology Deployment Pilot Project. My name is Jeremy Raw with the Federal Highway Administration Office of Planning, and I'm joined by several other folks, and we may as well move on to that screen and we'll explain who else is going to be talking today, in addition to all of you who are attendees. We will have a discussion section at the end that I'll just explain in a moment. Speaking from Federal Highway, there's obviously myself, Jeremy Raw. With me is Brian Gardner from the Office of Planning, and Dan Goodman from the Office of Human Environment. And both Brian and Dan actually, let's see if we can get people to mute their lines. I'm not sure who snuck in there. I thought everybody was muted. In any case, from the Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center, we have a technical support team that includes experts and specialists from across the country. They'll introduce themselves in more detail later, but I'll just run through the names. Carl Sundstrom, Laura Sant, Frank Prue, Daniel Rodriguez, and Bob Schneider. You'll hear more from each of them later, explaining who they are and talking in detail about some of the technical issues related to this project. Carl, can you go to the next slide? There we go. Our agenda for this meeting today includes the agenda review. That's what we're doing now. I'm going to go through a roll call and have everybody on the line hopefully be able to introduce themselves. And the way we're going to handle, I'll explain how to handle that in a minute. I won't go into it now. Brian Gardner will give us an overview of this pilot project, where it came from, who's involved in it, what we're hoping to get out of it. Dan Goodman, who works with all things bicycle and pedestrian related for Federal Highway, will talk more broadly about related activities that are underway at USDOT and at Federal Highway in particular. After Dan's finished his presentation, I'll come back and talk a little bit about the logistics and schedule for the overall project. So agencies who are funded in the project, and we'll talk a little bit about folks who are on this call who are not part of that as well. Agencies who are funded are going to be getting grants to buy counters and actually go out and do counts. We're hoping that some of the folks who are volunteering for the technical support will also be doing counts, and they are in fact welcome to participate in the program as fully as they'd like. They're just not going to get counters paid for by us. And unfortunately, we'd love to buy counters for everybody, but there are limits to what we can do with funding. Brian will explain a little bit more about what we're hoping to get and how that all fits together. Once we talk about the project logistics and schedule, we'll go over into the technical presentation, which will be about 40 minutes, that will set up the whole question of how and why we do bicycle counts. And following that presentation, we'll have an opportunity to do an open line discussion in which each of you can ask questions. Now, one of the things I'll point out right at the beginning, before we get to the logistics and schedule, because you may have questions right away, is if you look to the side of the screen that's actually showing me the slides, you'll be able to see the sort of master control of this thing, and down at the very bottom of that is a section that says chat. And if you expand that, you can type questions in there that are visible to all the other participants, including the people who are organizing this thing. And we will either, one of us will answer those questions as we go along, or we can pile them up and leave them for the discussion. And that'll sort of be at the discretion. If it's a quick question, type it in, we'll try and answer it. Otherwise, we'll leave those for the discussion. Finally, when we wrap up, we'll talk a little bit about where we're going next with this project, what the expectations are for each of you in terms of next steps that you'll take in order to stay participating. And we'll go on from there. So that's the agenda. Let's move on to the next thing. And we'll carry on. The next item is the roll call. So, Carl, can you flip the slide? And what I'm going to do is go down the list of people. Basically, I'm assuming that everybody who's on the call is also signed into the webinar, since they kind of go hand in hand. And I'm going to walk down the list and focus on people who are not presenters. So we're going to walk down the list here. I'm going to call out your first name, and I'd like each of you to speak up and say your name, the agency you're with, the city and state you're in, so that other people who are on the call can get a sense of who's with us today. So starting in here, I think the first person that I see, and some of the folks here I'll also admit are other Federal Highway staff who are in the division offices and elsewhere, and I'm still going to ask you to introduce yourself. And the reason I say that is the first person up is Carl, mix up, McKiska. Not with us, okay. Corey Baba?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, where are you from, Corey?
Rhode Island.
Okay, great. Daniel DiBiaso? If I say your name wrong, please repronounce it for me. Okay. Looks like David Henderson's on mute. Diane Bedorek. Not sure we've got folks out here. Eric Peel.
Hi, Jeremy. I'm here.
Okay. Tell us where you're from, Eric.
Oh, apologies. I'm with the FHWA Resource Center, and I'm based out of Denver, Colorado.
Okay. I see Francesca Taylor. May or may not be there with the line. Gabe Rousseau. Whoops. Somebody was, hey, Gabe. Let's see. Carrying back on up there. Gabriella Arismendi.
Hello, everybody. I'm from Metroplan.
Hi, Gabriella. Joe Del Magori.
Hi, can you hear us?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, this is Joe Del Magori from the Southeastern Wisconsin Regional Planning Commission, Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
Great. Welcome, Joe. Johnny Limbaugh. All right. Joyce Newland. All right. Let's see. Kristen Langford. May or may not actually be live online. Kristen's working with the PBIC folks to help record the webinar. Christine Kai. Appears to be on mute. Okay, so Laura Sand.
I'm here. I'm with the Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center that's based in Chapel Hill, North Carolina.
Great. Welcome, Laura. Laura Toole. All right. Not hearing a response. Leanne Jacobs.
Good afternoon. I'm in the Florida Division of Federal Highway.
Great. Mac Frost. Mac may be on mute.
Mac is on the call, but his audio seems to provide a feedback loop, so I've got him muted.
Okay, that's fair enough. Sorry about that, Mac. Welcome anyway. Mac's from the Virginia Division. Maria Chow. Mark Farrell. Martha Bravo Palunga. All right. Matt Schreiber. Okay. Michael Moan. And I'm wondering, actually, if folks would type into the chat pod, I mean, and some of you may be silent just because you're not eager to say anything, but I'm concerned that we're going to have a little trouble with the discussion. Technically, I see the question that when you originally came on, you were in listen-only mode. We did try to enable everybody's audio along the way, but it looks like some folks are muted. So we'll see. If you can try speaking up when I call your name, we'll see if we can get through. Robert Kohler.
Hello, it's Taylor, Bob Taylor. NPO.
Bob Taylor.
OKI. Yes.
Okay, welcome from OKI.
Muted.
Also, I'll just mention that. Yeah, we'll.
You were muted for some reason. I'm trying to unmute you right now.
Okay. All right. So, let me see. Actually, I have the roll call here. I'm just going to read off the remaining names on this: Shakira Crandall, Steve Church, Timothy Trebald. We have the UNC Highway Safety Research Center hosts for the Pedestrian Bicycle Information Center, and Valerie Nielsen. I think we're going to skip the roll call and we'll move on because this is taking time and it looks like we've got some technical issues. We'll try and figure out what's going on with the muting in time for the discussion and see if we can pull that off successfully later on. Sorry for these technical issues. So if we could move on to the next slide, I think I'm going to hand this over to Brian Gardner to introduce the project, and we'll move through that. Brian, welcome, and tell us about the program.
Will do. Thanks, Jeremy. Again, as Jeremy said, this is the kickoff of the first Bike and Pedestrian Count Technology Program. Welcome to the Providence, Rhode Island MPO, the Greater Buffalo, Niagara, New York Regional Transportation Council, the Richmond, Virginia Regional Transportation Planning Organization, the Puerto Rico MPO, San Juan, the Palm Beach County, Florida MPO, Fresno, California Council of Government, the Indian the OKI Council of Government, the Southeast Wisconsin Planning Commission in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the Memphis, Tennessee Metropolitan Planning Organization, and finally, welcome and a big thank you to our Federal Highway Division folks for the ideas, comments, and help in getting the pilot launched. FHWA recognizes the need to improve data resources for planning generally, and especially for non-motorized travel. The Pedestrian Count Technology Pilot Program helps with that in a couple of ways. First off, it's a catalyst, an introduction to data collection technology such as magnetic induction, piezoelectric, active and passive infrared. And this is an opportunity to try out best available counting technologies. It's also an introduction to new data. Bike and ped counts are quite different from vehicle counts. And by partnering with MPOs interested in bicycle and pedestrian count data, we're hoping that after completing the pilot, some of you and your local agency members will find enough value in the data to go out and get more of it in support of your ongoing program work. FHWA is also improving resources for managing non-motorized data. For example, the Travel Monitoring Guide includes chapters on non-motorized counts. We're developing a web-based reference to help translate that part of the TMG into practice. We're also working with the state to develop procedures for non-motorized count factoring, and we're also working to incorporate bicycle and pedestrian counts into the same procedures for reporting HPMS vehicle counts. The lessons learned in this Count Technology Pilot Program will help us improve these and other national efforts that Dan will be telling you about here in a minute. Finally, we're looking to build experiences with the technology and data in order to share them back with your peers in the larger MPO community so that they can learn from your efforts to get access to counters and in working with the bicycle and pedestrian count data. With your help, this Count Technology Program will provide a lot of practical experiences that will benefit all of us. Thank you for taking a chance to make a difference in your region. Now I'll turn it over to Dan Goodman to brief you on the key national bicycle and pedestrian initiatives related to the Count Technology Pilot Program. Dan?
Okay, great. Thanks, Brian. Thank you all for participating. I just want to start out by thanking you all. We are really looking forward to working with you on this exciting project. My name is Dan Goodman. I'm in the Office of Human Environment at FHWA. And what I want to mention to you before we kind of kick things off, I sort of want to build off of what Brian talked about, and I want to mention a few things that are happening now and that will be ongoing through the pilot. And the reason I want to mention these is really to demonstrate that your participation in the pilot is going to have positive impacts beyond the pilot and also beyond your city, because we're planning to use this experience to inform our efforts nationally on pedestrian and bicycle counting and more broadly on pedestrian and bicycle transportation planning and design. So a few things that I want to mention that this pilot is going to inform. The first thing is FHWA right now is working on a strategic agenda for pedestrian and bicycle transportation, and this project is ongoing right now. It's going to be going all the way through 2015, and we'll be wrapping up early in 2016. Basically the same time frame as this pilot. One of the really important outcomes of that project is going to be to lay out a strategy for where USDOT and FHWA needs to go in the next 3 to 5 years on pedestrian and bicycle counting and data initiatives in general. So we're really looking at this pilot and your experience in this pilot to inform that part of our strategy in the Strategic Agenda project. There's also a Safer People, Safer Streets initiative, which I hope everybody has heard of by now. Secretary Fox launched this initiative in the fall at the Pro Walk, Pro Bike conference. And right now we've got pedestrian and bicycle safety assessments happening in every state. And we also have a mayor's challenge underway. And we've got more than 200 cities have signed up to make it a commitment to improving pedestrian and bicycle safety over the next year. There's 7 challenge activities as part of the mayor's challenge, and one of those is specifically focused on pedestrian and bicycle data. So we'll really be looking for opportunities to sort of have the pilot that we're running as part of this program inform the mayor's challenge, and specifically the cities that say that they want to improve the way that they are counting pedestrians and bicyclists in their city. FHWA is going to be putting out a separated bike lane planning and design guide pretty soon. There's going to be an appendix in the guide focused on data collection, and I think that there will be some opportunity to bring the pilot experience, counting experience, together with that data collection appendix in our separated bike lane planning design guide, especially for the pilots in this program that have separated bike lanes, also known as protected bike lanes or cycle tracks. If you either have them or you're planning to implement them at some point soon, we would encourage you to think about ways to bring that data collection appendix together with your activities on the pilot. We're working on a guidebook for evaluating, establishing, and tracking pedestrian and bicycle performance measures. Obviously, the volume and the counting activities are an important part of performance measures, so I think that the pilot will inform that project. And then there's, obviously the traffic monitoring analysis system that Brian and Jeremy are heading up, and there's going to be a lot of opportunities to really learn from the experience of the pilot and inform our activities to really be able to improve the TMAS system to be able to receive pedestrian and bicycle data. And I guess the last thing I'll say is that as part of our strategic agenda project, we'll be thinking about how a program like this could be expanded or scaled up. And I think your participation in the pilot is really going to help us make those decisions moving forward. So those are the main things that I want to mention. I want to thank you all again, and I'm going to pass it back to Jeremy to move us forward.
Thanks, Dan. Our next point is to talk about the logistics of the project. There are 2 key resources that all of you should be aware of. I've included the links to these in the emails that you've received from us and the notification of this meeting. They're here again for your reference. First of all is the project website, www.pedbikeinfo.org/countpilot. That'll take you to a page specifically set up to support this activity. And we're going to be adding various documents. You'll find things there already. We're going to be adding various documents as we go forward, such as recordings of the webinar and supplemental information that we gather for various purposes, often in response to your question. The second support resource is the Google group, which works as an email list, although you can also go online and just treat it as an online forum. That's groups.google.com/d/forum/counts-pilot. All of you, if you've received an invitation from me, all of you should be on that forum already. If you go there and it turns out that you need to get signed up, please get in touch either with me or Dan, which takes me to my third point on this slide, the primary project contact. If for some reason you need to talk to a live human being, if you have an administrative question or some question about what's going on, things aren't working right or whatever, and you'd just like to talk to a person, feel free to call either me or Dan. We're going to be the primary points of contact. We may, if necessary, put you in touch with some of the folks on the technical support team. But we'll try and deal with that from our end, and to the extent that you have questions that are of interest to others, we'll push those back out onto the Google group list and make sure that there are answers out there. And if we need additional documentation, that'll end up on the website. So let's have the next slide. In terms of the schedule for this project, we're looking at approximately a year-long schedule for the formal participants. We're going to be working on counter procurement initially, and that's going to take place now through July. People are going to try and, we need all of you who are ordering counters to get them ordered up so that we can actually have them in place sometime in August. There'll be the deployment in August initially to calibrate the counters, figure out how they're working, get used to what's going on. And then we're going to do 2 rounds of count collection and analysis. And what happens in all of that is stuff that we'll talk about in subsequent webinars a little bit today, actually, in the technical presentation as well. And the idea is to try and catch fall and spring data at a number of different locations, moving the counters around a bit. Initially, as the procurement is going on, we'll also be working with you guys on the Google group and in the next webinar to decide where you actually want to do the counts, because deciding where to count is often as important as doing the counts themselves to getting good information. So we'll want to talk about that and make sure you're all comfortable with what's going on. There is some reporting for those of you who are receiving grants. We'd like to receive an initial set of counts from you and information about where you collected those counts by December. And then the final report on this project as we close it out is going to be due roughly in April of next year. We are going to be doing additional webinars along the way. There will be one scheduled for the end of May, and we'll talk about the date and time for that later on. And I'll say all of these are going to be recorded. If you miss them, you can come back around. If there's important information that you need to know, that's also going to be on the website, often as a document. So these additional webinars will go over various things like what do you do with the counts after you have them, how do you design additional count locations, and we'll have a number of other technical topics of interest. So I think that's actually everything I have to say, and I can turn it over now to Carl Sundstrom and the PBIC technical support team, and they'll go over our first set of issues for today. Carl?
Great, thanks, Jeremy. Uh-oh. Hold on a second. I seem to have lost my screen sharing. Huh. Okay, sorry about that, everyone. So just wanted to briefly introduce ourselves here as part of the PBIC Technical Assistance Team and help you all put a face with the name as we, you'll be hearing lots from us over the next many months. As part of the Technical Assistance Team that you'll hear from both on these Technical Assistance webinars that we'll be hosting as well as through that Google group and the listserv, we have Frank Krull with UC Berkeley Safe Trek, Daniel Rodriguez with the UNC Chapel Hill Department of City and Regional Planning, Bob Schneider with the University of Wisconsin Milwaukee School of Architecture and Urban Planning, and I'm Carl Sundstrom with the Pedestrian Bicycle Information Center here at the University of North Carolina Highway Safety Research Center. And so the goal of today's technical presentation as part of this kickoff is really just to provide you all with a little bit of background and information that you need to just start thinking about what are your goals for the project, and what type of equipment may you need, and sort of what questions you need to ask and how are you going to procure that equipment. So we'll start off today. Daniel will give some background on the purpose of a counting program and some of the resources that are out there. And then Bob will move on to talk about selecting locations. And then finally, Frank will finish up with some information about the different equipment that's available to you all, and what its purpose are and how effective this equipment can be. Finally, we'll just come back to briefly talk about the technical assistance schedule moving forward, and then we'll open it up for discussion with the group. So at this point, I will turn it over to Dan.
Yes, thank you, Carl. So many of you reported in your survey some of the purposes for having a non-motorized count program, and we wanted to highlight here some of the key characteristics, and then I'll briefly report on some of the most common responses we received. The first purpose would be to measure facility usage, then evaluating before and after data, maybe demonstrating the impact of these investments. Third would be monitoring patterns, travel patterns and needs. Fourth would be a safety analysis, for example, coming up with a better denominator, a better exposure measure. Inform how projects get prioritized in the planning process. Feed a modeling and simulation process that might be going on at your MPO. Improve the planning process, and then also compliance with emerging policy or community interest. And lastly, identify perhaps some trends or influences like changes over time, land use, weather, demographics. I added two to my list. improving the planning process and compliance with policy or with responsiveness to community interest, because these are two new ones that we didn't have in the list and that emerged from your responses. So I thought it was very interesting to hear it and to include it here. I also want to highlight that the second one in this list, evaluating before and after data, was the most common response from your survey. So it's very useful to hear that that's a common interest, as well as the project prioritization. So identifying how to prioritize these projects. 4 of you identified that as one of your common interests. If we move to the next slide, please. What we want to highlight here is in more detail the website that we've put together, and I want to highlight what you have there right now. You heard from Jeremy, the webinars are there. You will also already have some resources, and particularly the NCHRP guidebook, and also a background report for this guidebook is available there. Of course, the traffic monitoring guide, the chapter 4, which is very helpful. You see the TRB e-circular, and also have a very helpful link to the TRB data committee. Within that, you're actually taken directly to the Bicycle and Pedestrian Data Subcommittee website, which has a lot of very helpful links that I think will be germane to the discussion that comes up. So I invite you to browse these websites once we're done, see what is helpful, and see how it's going to get enriched as we move forward with this project. So the first question that I want to answer in the next slide is, well, why are we doing automated counts? And this is something that most of you intuitively understand. That's why you are here to begin with. And the bottom line is that 1 or 2 hour manual counts don't really cut it, really don't provide an accurate picture of what's happening in our facilities. There is important variation within day. And you see in the lower left-hand side, for example, that bimodal pattern, the morning peak and the afternoon peak. In other places, it might not be like this. In other places, if you're looking at walkers, you might have a lunch peak, depending on the context. But there's also variation across days. So you see here Thursday, that very low peak in the afternoon. It's important to capture that variation. And then you'll see also the weekends having perhaps a different distribution pattern. And then you have variations across weeks, across seasons. So it's important to understand these variations, and that's why the automated counts come for us as a relatively less expensive over time, gets amortized over weeks or months, depending on whether you're using temporary or permanent counters, and allows us to provide a much richer description of what's happening in our facilities. On the right-hand side, you see the graph, again, from Arlington, Virginia, about variations with based on precipitation in this case, but you also have other types of weather patterns that influence demand. And so these are common reasons why we want to automate our counts. Now, there's 2 types of counts, as we show here in this next slide. The first type of count would be kind of an intersection count. This is what's shown in the top of the slide here. If you're thinking about a pedestrian can cross basically in 4 ways. If you're interested in directions, which you might frequently be interested in directions, you have actually 8 different counts to make here for pedestrians. If you think about bicycles, depending on the configuration, you might have more than 12 potential movements. You're turning right, you're turning left, you're going straight, and you're coming from 4 different directions at the very least. Intersection counts are complex. Many areas want to do this and do this frequently. And I want to highlight the next one. If you press the down button in the slide, we'll highlight the screen line counts, which basically are the imaginary line that you're crossing, and we're doing the counting. So it's normally mid-segment, not at the intersection. You're frequently measuring both directions and the same facility for pedestrians, as indicated here. And it depends on the facility for bicycles. If you're in a trail, you might be doing that. If you are in a street, for example, as shown here, you might be looking at bicycle in one direction and doing a screen line count on the opposite side for pedestrians and bicycles in the other direction. Now, what we want to do now is have Bob highlight some of the challenges that has and difficulties that have arisen based on our experience, particularly on bicycle data collection. So, Bob?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Daniel. I'm going to expand a little bit on what Daniel said in several of his points. First of all, automated counters that are available today for practical use are screen line counters. And so we're detecting at a location that, like Daniel showed, along a trail, for example, or along a sidewalk or along a street segment. And Carl, if you can flip through the next several slides, I want to just point out that's what we're detecting, but there are lots of other complex movements at intersections that we're not collecting with these types of technologies. So you can flip through this full slide just to see all the different movements that could be considered. And it's not just the ones right at the crosswalks or exactly following a typical movement that you may see at an intersection for vehicles, since there's more flexibility to move as a pedestrian or bicyclist. So that creates a challenge for some of the data that we're trying to collect and being able to classify these movements into specific groups. So that's one point to keep in the back of your mind. One way that we simplify that is just doing the screen line counts and not address the intersections just yet in the data collection program. You can keep flipping to the next slide as well. I wanted to point out also that in your surveys, you pointed out several other challenges to data collection, including putting counters out during weather events, potentially having lack of local support, issues of lack of funding or resources, time to do these counts, for example. And those are all really important challenges to talk about. And we can maybe get into some of those during the discussion. But mostly what we're talking about right here are the technical challenges and the issue of using the right tools and the right methods to get an accurate count to achieve your counting purpose. Now, you can flip to the next slide. One of the most common strategies that agencies are using to do pedestrian and bicycle count programs is to use a combination of automated counters and manual counters. What automated counters do is collect data over a long period of time, so you can see those patterns that Daniel was highlighting in his previous slides. The challenge with automated counters is that they're relatively expensive to obtain initially, and so you may not be able to have an automated counter at 100 different count sites throughout your region. So what agencies tend to do is also collect short-term counts, and this is often done using manual counting methods, putting somebody out in the field to count for a few hours, and then extrapolating those out to longer time periods based on the automated count patterns that would represent that location. So in that way, they're using the manual counts to cover a greater geographic area. And so these two types of counts need to be done together and complement each other. And to make that work, we have to understand what typical patterns look like. And so Daniel was getting at that, but I'm going to expand on it just a little bit in a moment. You can flip to the next slide. When one of the challenges that several of you mentioned in the survey was selecting locations for counts. And there are several different ways to do that, and I'll cover these here. First of all, random locations is one very simple method to think about. That would be to, if you have locations across a county to consider, you would put all of those in a hat, for example, and pick out up to 50 of them, for example, and those are the locations that you choose. A disadvantage of that is that you're likely to end up with locations that either don't have much pedestrian or bicycle activity or aren't of particular interest to the community. So agencies have tended to use some of the other techniques more often than just randomly choosing locations. Stratified random sampling allows you to classify potential locations throughout the community and then choose within particular categories of interest. So the example that I have on the right side is from counting that was done in Alameda County, California in 2008. And when we did that, we stratified all the locations around the county by population density, employment density, and income levels. And so we had 3 categories of each of those, and within each of those 3 categories, we chose a certain number of locations, and within those, we chose randomly. So we ended up coming up with locations that ultimately represented each of those categories. Targeted locations are useful for what Daniel mentioned before, for the before and after studies, for example, of particular treatments. So if a new trail section or a new roadway crossing is going to be improved, you may want to collect data before that is done and then again afterwards. And so that location has been targeted to try to capture the effects of that infrastructure improvement. A disadvantage of that, of course, is that you're focusing on areas where there are changes happening, and you may not be representing the broader changes throughout the community in pedestrian and bicycle activity levels. And then a final strategy is representative locations, and this is something that I'm going to expand on the next slide, and it's probably the most common strategy that's being used right now in count programs. You can flip to the next slide. What this does is follows a method that has commonly been used in motor vehicle traffic monitoring, which is to identify what are called factor groups. And these are sites that have similar activity patterns. Examples are common AM and PM peaking for commuting to a downtown area, or a recreational pattern with high activity during the afternoon along a trail, for example. These really take on the characteristics of nearby land uses because the activity is related to what's going on at those land use locations. You can flip to the next slide. I want to give 2 examples of these types of factor groups. Colorado DOT, when they established their pedestrian and bicycle counting program a few years ago, they identified several factor groups. One of them was commuting factor group, and you can see from this graph that many of these locations, or all of the locations within this group, had lower volumes on Sundays and Saturdays and higher volumes during the weekdays when people are more likely to commute to work. On the next slide, we show a utilitarian factor group from several cities around North America. And so all of the count locations within this group tended to have a high morning peak and a high afternoon commute peak. And this graph is a nice way to talk about how these patterns are actually used when estimating and extrapolating out to longer term time periods. So for example, if you take a 1-hour count during the 8 a.m. hour and you know that your location fits this pattern, what you can do is divide that count by 0.1. So if I count 50 bicyclists during the 8 a.m. hour, I divide that by 0.1 and estimate that there are 500 bicyclists during the entire day. That's the same concept that we use when we expand out to a week, a month, or the entire year. But it's really important to use the correct factor group, because if you go to the next slide, you can see how this utilitarian factor group compares to a recreational factor group. With the recreational factor group, if we look at that 8 o'clock hour, it's only representing 2 or 3% of the daily volume. So if we apply the recreational factor to a location, a factor group to a location that actually belongs in the utilitarian factor group, we're going to be 4 or 5 times off when we're doing our estimate of the daily volume. So it's really important to understand which pattern you have at certain locations and to select those locations that fit within certain factor groups. This is an area of research that's continuing to develop. So we're getting a better handle on it, but we're still not 100% accurate on everything yet. So that's a discussion that we'll continue to have as we go along, but we're getting better. Next slide. There are some really important practical considerations to think about when you're going to be working with municipalities to ultimately install your technologies for counting. So first of all, it's important to talk with them about the locations you may be considering for putting in the counters. You guys in the survey responses suggested that you already may have some ideas for those locations, which is great, but it's also going to be important to partner with the local agencies to find their support for getting permits and doing the installation that may be needed. An important part of that process will be obtaining permissions to put counters in certain locations. As MPOs, you may have a very easy time getting permission to do pavement cuts or to install a sensor on a utility pole, but it's really important to think about what permissions may need to be obtained before the project starts. And finally, really thinking about who needs to be trained and educated about collecting the data from the field and making sure that those processes are in place so that when data are actually collected, that goes smoothly. Next slide. And the last thing that I wanted to mention is about the count duration. I think several of you guys also asked about that in the survey. And this is where it's a little bit, it's important to think about the possible options for how long to keep a counter in a location. Since counters may be movable from one place to another, how long is it important to keep it in place? So one recommendation that we have from other guidance is that to get some sense of the activity pattern throughout the day and then throughout days of the week, we should collect data for at least 2 weeks in a certain location. Of course, it's important to remember that if we can keep that sensor at that location for a longer time period, we can get more reliable estimates of the pattern itself, which makes it more accurate when it's estimating the longer term volumes. So this is an important thing to consider, and we may talk about that more during the discussion as well. So I want to turn it over to Frank, who has more details about the different types of counting technologies.
Okay. Thanks, Bob. Most of what I'm going to talk about here is drawing on guidance from the NCHRP 719 project and the resulting report 797 guidebook on pedestrian and bicycle volume data collection. The purpose of this project was to overall address the lack of pedestrian and bike volume data in the state of practice and establish what is being collected currently and explore ways to increase the amount of data that can be collected and explore what methodologies exist. As part of that, we conducted testing of a variety of different data collection technologies and methods and published results on accuracy of the different technologies and different things to keep in mind when using various technologies. Can I get the next slide? So this has been alluded to previously, but when working with automated count technologies, there's kind of two applications that you might be facing. One of those is installing a long-term counter, so something that's permanently installed, either cut into the pavement or in a post that's permanently on site. And as both Daniel and Bob have mentioned, from a long-term continuous counter like this, you can get estimates of those long-term temporal patterns in the volumes, and based on that, develop adjustment factors for use at your short-term count sites, which would be the other application. So this would be taking mobile counters and moving them from site to site to increase your spatial coverage and get more information about a greater number of sites throughout your region. For the most part, we expect that most of the participants in this pilot project will be doing short-term counts, just in attempts to generate a wider spread of data throughout your region, but that's not necessarily binding by any means. Somebody might be interested in getting a long-term counter installed. So these are kind of just two ways you can approach it. Regardless of which of these you're doing, though, it's important when your counter has been installed to go and do a validation counts, manual counts, to compare against the automated counts and make sure everything is working correctly. Get the next slide. So here I'm just going to talk through a few different technologies that are out there, and these ones are highlighted because they're the ones that we tested in CHRP 719, but it's not to say that they're the best or the only out there, and we, in the guidebook, there are many more technologies discussed. Chapter 5 of that guidebook includes a couple of pages on about 15 different technologies with pros and cons of using each of them. And that's the thing to really keep in mind here, is that these different technologies are better or worse suited to particular applications. So in selecting a technology, it's important to think about where and how you might want to be using it. So first, passive infrared. This is probably the most commonly used technology for counting pedestrians. These work by detecting body heat of people passing by, so they don't distinguish between pedestrians and bicyclists. And so if you have mixed traffic, you're not necessarily going to get such as on a multi-use path, you're not necessarily going to get a separated count by bike and pedestrian. For the most part, they're very easy to install. It just takes a few minutes, so they're well suited to moving around between locations. Another thing to keep in mind is they need a backdrop, a solid backdrop behind them. They're sensitive to picking up things going on in the background. So, for instance, I've heard of light rail vehicles in the background picking them up. Certainly, automobile traffic might be detected. So, when you're on site and actually installing, getting those little details worked out is important. Another potential issue with these is this idea of occlusion. So that would be when two people pass by the detector simultaneously and only one is counted. This seems to be improving, but is kind of an inherent limitation of counting on a screen line like this. And so just something to keep in mind as that data is being collected. These also prove to be fairly accurate and precise in that they, on average, got good estimates, and there wasn't very much spread in the accuracy across multiple hourly observations. I can get the next slide. Next, we'll talk about active infrared. So when you hear infrared, this is probably what you first think of. This is where you would have a transmitter and a receiver with an infrared beam between them. And with these devices, the count is caused by somebody passing and breaking the beam, so to speak. These take a little bit more installation because they require the transmitter and receiver to be installed on opposite sides of the facility. So this might not be as well suited to sidewalk locations, for instance, as a passive infrared would be, but they might work better on a multi-use path where you have that ability to install the transmitter and receiver on either side. And these can mount either to existing poles that are on site, or as it looks like has been done in this image, you can put a temporary post in place for the transmitter and receiver. And these work pretty well from what we've seen, although there's not as extensively tested as some other devices. So now getting into some bicycle-specific applications, pneumatic tubes. So these are very commonly used for detecting motor vehicle traffic, but a number of products out there either are capable of counting both cars and bikes just by using different classification methods. And there are also some available that are specifically designed for the purpose of counting bikes, and so they are constructed with slightly smaller tubes and just have a higher sensitivity to the lower weight of bicyclists. All of the testing that we did was using bicycle-specific counters on, for the most part, just on multi-use paths and in bike lanes, and they generally also work well at high volumes. These are better suited to short duration applications, particularly if you're installing them at an on-street location where they will be in contact with car traffic, just because the tubes over time wear out as heavier vehicles roll over them. So if you want to use these at multiple on-street locations, you might need to have backup tubes to replace them as they get worn. Next. We also tested radio beam counters. So these are functionally very similar to the active infrared, except that instead of an infrared beam, there's a radio beam between them. Also, some of these are capable of distinguishing between bicyclists and pedestrians by using different wavelengths of radio beam. So these we didn't find in our testing worked as well. We had a little bit of difficulty with getting them to work as we wanted, but having that distinguishing capability within a single sensor is definitely appealing. So if you have a situation where you want to get separate bike and pedestrian counts, this might be a good option. Next. So also inductive loops are pretty commonly used for counting bikes. These are very similar to the loops that are used for signal actuation. They just involve loops of wire either dug under the surface or placed on top of the surface of the street or path, and based on the metal in bikes going over them are able to conduct counts in that way. They seem to work pretty well even when dealing with carbon fiber bikes. There's been more targeted testing to make sure that works, and they seem to work well there. These are permanent installations for the most part, although there are some, those on the surface loops, that are kind of a semi-permanent thing where they don't require cutting into the pavement or anything, but they'll over time wear out. So that would be for like a six month to a year maybe application. One thing to bear in mind with inductive loops is if you're counting in a bike lane and your inductive loops cover the extent of the bike lane, they won't pick up anybody outside of the bike lane. So that's just something to be wary of when installing these. Similarly, if you have a multi-use path covered by multiple loops, there might be ride-arounds happening where people miss the detection zone. So in installing these, it's important to have all of those considerations in mind and discuss them with the vendor to make sure that you have your installation well situated for dealing with those cases. Next. Finally, the last technology we tested was piezoelectric strips. So these are a material, piezoelectrics are a type of material that when it gets deformed, it generates an electric current. So these work by contact. So if you have a bike roll over them, they work very similar to a pneumatic tube, except that in that they just take contact from a bike rolling over them, except that they're permanent installation. These are neat because you can extend the length of them across the width of the facility, and they seem to work very well from the one device that we did test. So overall findings, we found that the most important things really in getting good accuracy out of automated counters are making sure that you calibrate your device and install it properly to the vendor specifications. Occlusion is an issue for most screenline type counters, so that's just something to keep in mind. And there did seem to be differences between vendors in terms of level of accuracy. So with all of that, the really important thing, I think, is to know the limitations of the particular technology that you're using and understand what situations it's well suited to and what situations it's not well suited to, and use it appropriately. We didn't find any evidence of accuracy decreasing from as a result of temperatures, which we thought might be the case with the passive infrared because it is based on detecting body heat, or snow and rain. We didn't, just not many effects of weather that we could see. This was all somewhat limited in amount of data, but it's promising that they seem to work well throughout the year. Go to the next. And so this is just a summary of our findings, where the first column is the average percentage deviation between the automated count and the manual count, and the second column would be is the absolute average percent deviation. So the first detects on accounts on, or the first indicates on average how accurate the device is, and the second indicates how much spread there is in the data. So on average, with the absolute deviation from the perfect accuracy. Go to the next. So, as I suggested, there's a couple of different things to consider in making your equipment selection, and the biggest of those is, what are you counting? What do you want to count? And second, how long? So this comes from the traffic monitoring guide, and the different directions you might be looking are bicyclists only or pedestrians only, or do we just want a total non-motorized traffic volume, so peds and bikes combined, or do we want pedestrians and bicyclists separately? So based on which type of traffic you want to count, different technologies have particular applications that they're well suited to, as well as the duration of the count. So some are permanent installations; they have to be dug into the ground, and so there's not much mobility possible, all the way to the most mobile, which would be the manual observers, so just going and doing counts by hand. The third dimension to think about here is the facility type. So whether you want to be counting on a sidewalk or a bike lane or a shared travel lane or a multi-use path are probably the dominant cases that you'd be thinking about. So these different technologies are also better or worse suited to those applications. Another consideration is that the sensor technology is just one piece of the system. So all of these findings I've presented are about the different technologies, but when you're going and procuring equipment, there's multiple different pieces that come into play. There's the sensor that gets the information from the environment, and then that gets analyzed by the counter, which saves it in the logger and communicates that in some way to you. This might be via a cellular network, or it might require going out to the field and plugging something into the device or connecting via Bluetooth. So there's various different aspects to different products to think about in making your selections. Okay, awesome. And so finally, when making your selection, there's a lot of different questions you might want to be asking yourself and asking your vendor. So is the device ready out of the box, or am I going to have to put pieces together and figure out how it works? Some you can basically take out of the box and go strap them onto a pole and they're ready to go. Others you have to build the loops, or whatever it is. Different technologies have different readiness to deploy associated with them. It might be good to think about if there's any sort of warranty to damage in case your device gets damaged by water or something. Installation time and whether it's something that you or somebody in your agency will be able to handle, or if it might take hiring out to a contractor. So if you, for instance, don't have the ability in-house to conduct saw cuts, will that need to be hired out? Security and durability, so is it prone to being stolen or not? How is the data downloaded? Do you have to go out to the field every time you want to get your data, or do you get it uploaded to yourself, uploaded to their server to see at the end of every day, for instance? Data format, so is the data in just a simple CSV file, or is it in some sort of proprietary format that requires a vendor software to access? There are pros and cons to both of those, and that the CSV it's much easier to give to people and share, whereas a proprietary format might have nice analytical tools built into the product. And then finally, customer support. As you talk to vendors, you'll get a feel for the degree of support that they'll be giving you throughout the process, and you can ask about that and get a feel for what they'll be providing you over the term of your being a customer to them. So that's all I had to present on here today. I've got a couple of questions I see. First, are the passive infrared able to distinguish between PEDs and bikes? No, they cannot. They just get a count out of people going by, of a number of bodies that are seen, so that doesn't make a distinction. The second is for more clarity on the table with the results. So these, Carl, could you go back a couple slides to that? That one. Yes, I'll talk about this a little bit more in depth. So these are the results of our testing these various technologies, and what was done here is the technologies were installed in the field, and we conducted manual counts on video footage and compared the automated and manual count totals by hour to see, on average, whether the device was over or undercounting. Most of these are undercounting, and so you get a feel for, from the first column, how far on average the device's accuracy is, or how far on average the counts are from the totally accurate, the manual count. So the idea there is that you can, if you take your automated count and you adjust it, you can get closer to the accurate volume. The second column, the average absolute percent deviation, suggests after that adjustment is made, how much spread might still be in the data. So how dispersed the data might be, and so how inaccurate your count still might be after making that adjustment. So there, I think I'll turn it over now to Carl to talk on the last couple points here.
Yeah, great. Thanks to Daniel and Bob and Frank for giving us that really helpful overview. And we'll certainly have plenty of time for a good discussion, both on this kickoff call and, of course, the listserv is always available if you have any questions, or just want to share your experience with the other MPOs. So Jeremy sort of touched on this towards the beginning about the technical assistance moving forward, and we've basically designed 4 technical assistance webinars from now through December. And so the idea here is that we will present on topics that we think you all should be focusing on at that certain stage in your counting program. And so roughly the first half, we expect to provide a technical presentation, sort of like the one we had today. And then the second half, maybe we'll ask you all to kind of give a bit of share a little bit of your experiences to date and offer up any experiences or challenges that you may think are helpful to share with the group. So up on this slide here, you can see May 29th, and Jeremy, we have a later slide that'll show the exact time, but May 29th will be the next technical assistance call, and then we'll hold one in August, October, and December. And these are generally the topics that we expect to have on each one of these calls, which should go along quite nicely with where you all are in your count program. So May 29th we'll go into more detail on particularly on site selection and how to installing equipment, and then you can see further on we'll get more into detail about data and what you can actually do with the data, and so I think with that I know there's probably quite a few questions, so I believe we can. Not sure how we want to handle the questions. I suppose the chat pod may be a good way due to people's microphones being muted, and then I'm sure we can unmute your microphone as well if you wish to ask a question. But I will turn it back over to Jeremy and Dan and Brian and the rest of the group.
Thanks, Carl. This is Jeremy once again, and I'll just mention to folks that my screen is locked up, and so I'm going to attempt to log back in so that I can see the chat pod live. But feel free to type in any questions that you may have about information that you've heard, about questions where we're going to go forward. I know Francesca had posted a question about possible applications of funds under the program, and I'll talk to her offline about that. And if you do have questions about the funding, about the content of the technical support, about what we're going to cover, about what you think we should cover, don't hesitate to get in touch with me or Dan. So that said, I'm going to try and get reactivated so I can actually see the chat pod. So if I happen to disappear and come back, is Dan or Brian out there? Could you handle this for a second?
Sure. This is Brian. I'll be
happy to Jeremy. Yeah, I'd be happy to.
Okay.
Maybe we can, while Jeremy logs back in, we can come back to the chat pod. I guess we've been talking for a while. I would be curious to open it up a little bit and ask the general question to the group, based on everything you heard, based on everything you know about kind of where we think we're going on this program and this pilot. What else do you need as you sort of set out, and embark on this pilot experience? Are there specific things that you feel like you need right now to get moving and get going in the right direction? And Carl, if you could help us unmute lines, that'd be helpful.
Almost everyone's unmuted by the organizers. They can mute themselves now. So.
Okay.
This is Daniel Rodriguez. I can add a question that's coming up here in the chat box by many, and it's about recommendations about count manufacturers, count technology. Where can everyone find some of this information so they can start moving forward?
Yeah, I guess I could speak to that a little bit, and then maybe Jeremy can jump in as well. I know on FHWA side, as part of this pilot, we can't choose winners. So it's going to be your decision to choose which technology you want to purchase. We would point you to that NCHRP report 0719, and actually somebody please remind me of the report number, Carl or Bob or Daniel, can you remind me of that?
797.
797. That's really the best place to start right now. If you're trying to figure out what you want to purchase, I would recommend right now that you just read that document from front to back. And it does a really excellent job of sort of laying out the main options and sort of positives and negatives of the different options. And it should help you point you in the right direction as far as if you want to capture certain types of information, it'll help you figure out which products are probably going to help you do that the best. Anybody else like to add on to that, Jeremy?
Hey, Dan, this is Bob. Sorry, Jeremy. Cut you off.
By all means, you'll know more than I do, Bob.
Well, there's some things maybe we can say and FHWA can't, or can we list some names of companies? Is that okay, even though we don't?
Yes, I can answer that as a policy question. We cannot, from Federal Highway, make a recommendation to people, you should buy this equipment. What we can certainly do is say, if you want guys on the technical support team can go out and just review who's out there selling this stuff and develop a list of vendors who are in this market, that's perfectly acceptable.
Great. Yeah, so just in alphabetical order from several that I have here, Chambers Electronics is the name of a company. EcoCounter is the name of another. Metro Count, then TDC. Frank, I think you know a couple of others maybe, or if I've forgotten any of them.
Trafex, I think, is one. JMAR used to make some stuff. I'm not sure if they still do or not. That's.
I would add Myovision, maybe?
Myovision, yeah.
But another point on the NCHRP project, as similar to what we were hearing from Dan and Jeremy, you will see in that report that there is no specific recommendation about a vendor. Again, because of constraints on really what could be said, you'll see more of an objective evaluation of different technologies. And so there will be a little bit of a sort of crossing of results and vendors to identify who can best provide the technology that you need for your specific application.
And I just want to point out that Bob put that list of vendors in the chat pod, so you can check it out there.
Also, throw out that that's just the list off the top of our heads, and there are probably other vendors out there, so it might be worth doing a little bit of a little research, and if anybody finds anything that looks interesting, it could be valuable to share with the other participants.
Yeah, I think we can make that an ongoing process there. You know, doing the market research, and anybody who's out there on the call and wants to do some market research and just contribute results to the Google group, that would be fine. I don't have a problem with that, and I think that would work great for everybody. And I think the technical support team can, you know, shake the bush a little bit and see if anybody else comes out. I mean, it's been a relatively small market for counters, but I know that more and more people are seeing the market for this and actually getting into it, the technology vendors themselves. So, you know, it's kind of a rapidly evolving field, let's say. All right. There was a question just administratively. I'm going to just grab one here at random about whether there's any requirement for monthly or quarterly reports about progress on the pilot program. We're not actually going to require formal reports other than a submission of a sort of statement of what you've done in December and then the final report in April. What we would like you to do, though, is participate regularly in the webinars and in the technical support discussion group. And if we don't hear from you for a while, I may take it upon myself to call you up and say, how's it going, and just check in that way. But really, the idea here is to not, I mean, this obviously is not a very large program, and we don't want to make it particularly burdensome for folks. And I'd rather you spend your efforts actually going out and collecting counts and figuring out what to do with them more than preparing formal reports back to us. So that's the answer to that question.
And if I could just emphasize one thing on the schedule, we set out, so our goal is that everybody's going to start counting around August, ideally, but we really want to make sure that we know that the early September is the time frame when the National Documentation Project does the official count, and we really want to make sure that everybody is up and running and counting in time for that. And so that's why we set our schedule a bit ahead of that, to encourage everybody to get the units, get them in the ground, try them out, and then by the time we get to September, hopefully we've got good data coming in from the different units.
Right. Okay. I mean, I'm looking down the chat pod here. There was a question about down the line, as we collect data and eventually expand our count system, can we potentially use this data as inputs for our transportation model, similar to how MPOs use traffic count data? Certainly that is a theoretical possibility. Practically speaking, people are still working on how to get information from counts taken on bicycles and pedestrians effectively into models, and I'm personally involved in a lot of research projects that are looking in that direction. Part of the reason that we want people to collect counts and to do it in as diverse places as possible is so that we can improve the modeling resources that we have available and come up with better estimates and forecasts for what might happen under different circumstances. So we're definitely heading in that direction, and collecting these counts will be part of that process in the long run. So another question is sort of related to that. Does FHWA have any requirements on the type of counts we collect, daily, peak hour, or classification? And the answer to that is no, but we would like you to think about, in the context of your own bicycle and pedestrian planning activities, what counts would actually be informative to you. And there are a lot of things. I mean, I'm hoping that we'll talk a bit about this in the next technical support webinar at the end of May. The question of what you're going to do with the counts is often very important in deciding where you want to collect the counts and when you want to collect them. For example, there may be an advantage to collecting counts over a couple of week period. In some places, you might actually want to go longer than that because you're trying to figure out what the pattern of activity there is in order to extrapolate from that, perhaps in other cases. So we don't really have requirements. What we want you to do is think about it, talk to the rest of us, and interact with the technical support team on the email list to help sharpen your idea of what's best going to serve your program.
If I could make one more plug also for FHWA separated bike lane document, that data appendix is going to have some recommendations about the duration of counts before or after construction of a cycle track, protected bike lane, separated bike lane. So we really would encourage you, if you have a separated bike lane or cycle track, or if you're planning one, to really grab that appendix as soon as it comes out and try to get counts done at the same duration that is noted in that appendix. That'd be really helpful, and it'd be a great. You've got a really good opportunity to be sort of a case study, first implementation of that information, which would be really helpful.
Great, thanks, Dan. So I guess Sarah asked, what time of day do the manual counters count to verify the automatic counters? I'll defer that out to the technical team. Frank, I mean, you might be able to answer that question about what would be best. My sense is you just want to do the manual counts at some time when it's convenient for the manual counters and when you think there'll be some traffic actually to count. But I'll hand that to Frank, who can answer that in more detail.
Yeah, that's the basic idea, and that you want to, go do it when you're out there already. It shouldn't matter that much, but the one consideration is trying to target a time period where there are people out there to count. So you don't want to go in the middle of the night, but you probably wouldn't do that anyway. So it shouldn't really matter. I also see a question here about problems with vandalism during 7/19. We had one device get stolen, if I remember correctly. I know of at least one. I don't think there were any more than that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll just add, this is Jeremy. I've talked to a lot of programs that have had counters installed in different nature and in different places. Permanent counters, ones that are permanently installed, are vulnerable, let's just say, to vandalism. The equipment manufacturers in many cases have actually figured out how to either disguise or protect the equipment pretty effectively. But it is something you want to keep in the back of your mind. And actually it goes into the site selection question, because putting counters in places where they're not easily seen from lots of eyes and where they might be vandalized by somebody who couldn't be observed or otherwise, those are things you might want to kick around in a subsequent session. I see another question. Do one of the guides give details of the site selection methods that were in Bob's slide? So technical panel, question about that?
Yeah, this is Bob. I'm going to look that up. It's in the 797 guidebook, so I'm going to type it into the page numbers into the chat box when I find it.
Okay, thank you, Bob.
Yep.
And we will actually have an opportunity to talk about that next time, because I think we're going to revisit the question of site selection in the next panel, right?
Yes, on May 29th.
Okay. And all right, good. Let me just scroll back up the list here and see if I missed any questions from higher up. I guess we had loosely talked about putting together a program that needed flexibility for a variety of locations in urban and trail settings. Did that I think that question came in as I was kind of offline. Technical panel, did we answer that one, or is that one that you'd like to take on? I dumbfounded them.
Jeremy, can you repeat it again, please?
Yes. So the question is, if you're putting together a program that needs flexibility for a variety of locations in urban or trail settings, what types would you purchase? I mean, I could give an answer to that myself, but I'll sort of defer to the technical panel who's thought about this.
I'd say I'd probably go with...
Go ahead, Bob.
This is Frank. I'd say I'd probably go with a combination of something like a passive infrared and pneumatic tubes, and that they're both very mobile, so and can work in a variety of different situations, but not necessarily a definitive answer.
And this is Daniel. I was just going to echo that. You given the flexibility that you need, you probably want a technology that you can move fairly easily and that works in trails and elsewhere. And so my initial gut would be to have some sort of passive infrared that allows you to identify pedestrians easily, and then some perhaps pneumatic tubes.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, this is Carl. The question was sort of touched, or the answer was sort of touched on earlier, but you know, so if you're on a trail, you would want to install both of those technologies or those counters in the same place. That way, you can use the counts to differentiate between pedestrians and bicyclists, because the infrared will not be able to do that. But then if you use the pneumatic tubes in conjunction with that, you'll be able to separate out the users.
Right. Yeah, this is Jeremy. I will add that there are some complications if you're expecting to count on-road bicycles with the same set of equipment. And so that's something that might be worth a discussion with the vendor. And it comes back again to the sort of purposes and situations in which you might consider counting for your own planning purposes. Good. I think I've done all the questions in the chat pod. If your question wasn't there, please feel free to type it in again.
Jeremy, there was one question about data reselling. I saw it a few minutes ago. I can look back. But the concern was that the data that was being collected from a counter was being uploaded to the cloud, provided by this seller, and whether that data could be resold then. And this came up in a meeting.
Well, yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, you know, in principle, any data that you collect at your agency belongs to the agency. I mean, you can get when we retrieve the data back. I mean, I'm you know, the purposes that we have for asking for the data back at Federal Highway, for example, we're not planning to publicize that immediately. We are working towards creating this traffic monitoring analysis system database for bicycle and pedestrian counts, and eventually we would like people to make voluntary contributions of their information so we can start to assemble national statistics on trends in bicycle and pedestrian activity, and also use that for additional research on, you know, safety exposure, you know, facility effects and benefits and impacts and things like that. In the short run, you know, there are a lot of ways that this data can be managed. We're not asking people to just sort of take the data and dump it out on the world at large. I mean, we can talk about that later on, and I think actually when we get into the data management and analysis portion of the technical support, we can really go through those things in detail. But, you know, any data that you collect is really, you know, you can pretty much expect it's going to be your data. And the rest of us are here really just to facilitate that process. Once we get the report of the data back, what we're going to attempt to do with it ultimately is try and integrate it in the traffic monitoring analysis system, but we won't do that without getting a formal release from people who have sent the data to us.
Jeremy?
Yes.
Hello?
Hello,
Hi,
yes.
sorry, this is Gabby from Orlando. Yes, I put in that question, and it's not from the when I wrote that in, it wasn't from the FHWA's perspective or anything regarding this particular study. Actually, I was told during that meeting that I guess for whenever the Bluetooth data that is done for automobile counts, so the actual vendor has some of them. They write it in the contract where the vendor can sell the data to a third party like McDonald's to place an ad so that they know where they can place an ad because of the highest volumes. And so that's why one of the questions was asked.
Yes, and that's actually an interesting question, because I know that certainly without naming names, at least one of the vendors that we put out in the list of vendors before provides data management as one of their support activities, although I don't think that they're necessarily reselling the data. So certainly that's something that you want to get into a discussion with the vendor on in the short run to make sure that what's happening with the data is something that you're comfortable with. And I'd say that as you go forward, looking at counters to buy and thinking about who you want to work with, asking those questions a little bit is important. And I think just having everybody be aware of the fact that that's even a possibility is probably a good thing. So thanks for bringing that up.
And I also had one question for, I guess, the technical team. I typed it in, but if, here in Orlando, we're a little bit ahead. And so we already have selected, we already think we know which vendor to go for and sort of our methodology and so forth. Can I send you guys what we have just to confirm that we're on the right path?
Absolutely.
Well, yeah, I think that's certainly not a problem. I mean, if you have anything that you'd like to keep sort of quasi-confidential and just get an opinion on, send it through me and Dan. If you don't mind other people in the group just sort of seeing it, you can put it out in the Google group, and everybody can have a shot at it and help out.
It might be helpful at this point, maybe just to clarify one thing about that coordination with the technical leads at PBIC on the PBIC team. If you could, obviously we want to share all the information on the listserv as much as we can kind of generate that conversation amongst all of us. That would be great. But if you do feel a need to ask them for kind of things that are going to take their time, as Jeremy mentioned, please make sure to go through Jeremy and I, because we're responsible for making sure that we stay within our scope and they don't get overburdened on individual requests. So that's part of our job, is to kind of monitor that amount of effort. So please go through Jeremy and I on those individual requests to the PBIC team.
All right. I think there was one more question. I realized that my chat pod got cleared when I got thrown off of the webinar. So this is part of why I'm struggling with some of the older questions that we didn't get to before. Bob had called out another one that he was going to ask about other device types like video that could be used. I think maybe, Bob, you want to try and take a crack at that question?
Yeah, so my fellow Wisconsinite, Joe, he asked the question about if video could be used. And what we found in our NCHRP study was essentially that video was being used somewhat similarly to manual counts. The existing technologies to put video up for a day or two was in some cases being done in a semi-automated process, but it was still charged by the hour, which is essentially how you would charge for manual counts. There may be technologies through video that are coming online in the coming years or getting close to market now that can do automated counts from video images and do that over a long period of time. So they aren't charged by the hour, but are charged by monthly or several months basis. I think those other technologies that may be able to collect the counts over a long period of time are what we would think of as an automated technology for this type of application. Does anybody else have anything to add on that? Frank, I know you've thought about this a lot too.
No, that about fits with my thoughts on it. But everything I've seen on the market is charged by the hour. Functional, similar to the manual count.
Yeah.
Cool. So let's see. The final, there was actually, I see there's one other question from earlier in the chat from Gabriella about sharing formulas on the Google group, formulas applicable to the MSAs. And that was a question about a piece of the conversation. I don't know, Gabriella, if you want to clarify that.
Yeah, sorry, I lost my mute button.
Okay.
So in one of the first slides, you guys were one of your, I can't remember who, but was going out that for manual counts, then multiplying them by 0.15, I believe it was. And so I wasn't sure whether that's a sort of a standard national formula that we could use, or is that mainly for high, big MSAs that are out there?
So, do we have an answer from the technical team about that?
Sorry, is the question about an expansion factor or an adjustment for undercounting?
I think it's about the expansion factors you presented on, Bob, with the utilitarian and recreational patterns. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Yeah, those are from. Those factors that Bob presented are from a study that took data from a few different cities and tried to pool them and come up with similar patterns across. So in principle, it should be applicable. But the question is figuring out for your site what pattern group you expect it fits into. And that's where it gets a little bit more tricky and takes a little bit of guesswork. But they, in principle, should work to some degree.
Excellent, thank you. Would you mind posting that for that particulars that formula on the Google group?
Yeah, I mean we could put. Those came out of a paper that I think we could put up on the website if it's not already there.
Yeah, and
isn't that also going to be covered in one of the future webinar topics?
Yes.
Okay, great. I see that we're at 3:30, and I don't necessarily want to cut this off, but I want to make sure that we're appropriately addressing next steps. So, where we're going from this, obviously we're going to reconvene in a few weeks to talk more about site locations, check in on how everybody's doing. In the meantime, if you've got any questions, post them on the Google group. We'll be using that also to let you know when new resources appear on the website. You can visit the website at any time, read into Report 797 and the backup and the technical report behind it. And also start thinking in your situation, where might you want to go to count? Where would you look to actually learn something useful? And our next webinar we've got scheduled for Friday, May 29th in the same time slot that we're doing today, 2 to 3:30 p.m. If you can't make it, let me know. We will be recording the webinar. If you think that Fridays are generally going to be bad for you, let me know that as well, because we'll take that into consideration as we schedule future sessions. We haven't really got dates and times for the later ones yet. Okay, so a couple of other questions here administratively that I think I can answer. One, to be sure the sites aren't, quote, due until December, or should they be included in the program plan on May 15th? I'd like you to actually list the sites earlier. What's due in December will actually be the list of locations and the actual counts from having done some counts. So in terms of planning and figuring out, I mean, the sort of drop-dead date for that is the point at which you've acquired some counters and you're ready to go, say in August or early September. That's when we actually need to have what the locations are, but probably in most cases folks are going to be buying portable counters and the count locations are going to be sampled in series. That is, you'll set the counter up someplace, then take it down, move it somewhere else, count somewhere else, and continue on like that. So, it's open-ended in that respect. The key thing between now and the 29th is to sort of come up with a draft list of places you might consider going, think about what the circumstances are at those locations and what kind of technology might be appropriate. So that you can start doing appropriate inquiries with vendors. Sarah asks, is there anything due to FHWA in the meantime? And the answer is no. It would be nice if we could see you raising your hand and speaking up and asking questions. That would be great, but that's really all we're looking for in the meantime. Those of you who are funded in this program, if you're having any issues with the funding, get back in touch with me. I know I've been working with one MPO and division office to settle some thorny problems, and I think I've got a solution with that, and I'll follow that up on Monday. So with that, any other questions that might be coming up at this point? I'm going to look back and see. I think I got a note that there was a question about the accuracy and spread slide, and I'm not sure that that got answered appropriately at the time. So you could raise that one again, or if there are other questions, by all means, let us have them.
Yeah, I would recommend that we try to answer those questions on the listserv if we can.
Yeah, I think that's fine too. Certainly, this is not your last opportunity to ask questions. So I think, it may in fact be courteous to everyone to call the webinar over at this point, since we're slightly over time, and we will. If you think of anything after the fact, don't hesitate to put it on the Google group, and we will carry on from there. So with that, I will thank all the participants today. Thanks everybody for enduring our little bit of technical issues at the beginning, and we will pursue this again on May 29th and probably interact heavily with all of you in the meantime. So thanks for being here.
Thank you again, everybody. We look forward to working with you.